Vault Hunters, Borderlands 4 is here, but before you take the fight to the Timekeeper, you better figure out what character to play, and you better figure it out fast. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and after playing every Vault Hunter and beating the game with each one, we wanted to share what makes them fun, what makes them powerful, and what makes them the right choice for you. Rafa is the balanced choice in Borderlands 4, offering up a little something for everyone regardless of your skill level, while also providing choices for his action skill, which change up his playstyle but not so drastically that he becomes difficult to play. His abilities are more independent than that of the other Vault Hunters, and it doesn't take a deep knowledge of build crafting to put something together that just works. There's still a ton of potential there, but for most players that want something easy to pick up and play, Rafa is a solid choice. Rafa's trait Overdrive is really straightforward. Whenever he activates an action skill, he gains increased damage and movement speed. This lasts the duration of the action skill and then lingers for a decent stretch of time after the ability ends. That's it. Incredibly simple. Rafa's first action skill is called Arc Knives. When activated, he puts away his guns and equips Arc Knives. While active, he can perform basic melee attacks and a dash attack that deals shock damage. Every enemy hit by the ability becomes marked, taking increased bonus damage for every mark on that target up to a maximum limit. You can also reactivate the ability, unleashing Blade Fury, which deals shock damage to all the marked enemies while simultaneously ending the ability. This one naturally encourages a more aggressive playstyle and allows you to ebb and flow between gunplay and your action skill without having to worry too much about synergy. There is certainly a dynamic between the two types of gameplay, but they're complementary, not interconnected. Now, what's so interesting about Arc Knives is how their gameplay completely changes based on the augment you have socketed. Dead Man Walking might be the most extreme case here, allowing you to keep your Arc Knives out until you enter Fight for Your Life. However, when active, you'll lose a percentage of your health per second. This one is wild, and you can build something pretty cool with this augment at the center. Now, other augments like Acid Drop and Thunder Cutter lean more into various damage types while also slightly changing the functionality of the blades. To make this even more interesting, the capstones are wildly different, and they're worth experimenting with. Huracan Especial embraces shock damage while also creating a singularity effect. Inferno Protocol takes stored damage and converts it into bonus incendiary damage, and Galvanic Panic summons an acid storm glider that deals corrosive splash damage based on the number of marked targets. All three capstones synergize off of how many marks Rafa has out, which is why you want to damage as many enemies as possible to maximize the effect. Rafa's second action skill is called Peacebreaker Cannons. When active, a pair of cannons materializes on Rafa, automatically dealing damage to enemies you're actively targeting. This is about as automatic as you can hope for with an ability, and while not the flashiest, it's a great skill for beginners, those less confident in their combat skills, or players who want to pump out a serious amount of consistent damage. What I enjoy about the Peacebreaker Cannon augments is how versatile they are, changing up an aspect of the action skill without removing its identity altogether. The Tier 1 options are solid, especially Bullet Buddy Deluxe, which not only regenerates ammo for you and your allies when active, but also allows you to trigger a special state where your shots consume no ammo at all at the expense of action energy. This can turn weapons that are normally limited by ammunition into serious monsters at the precise time. Both Tier 1 options provide nice bonuses as you're leveling up and need that extra firepower to take down large groups of enemies, badasses, and bosses, but it's the Tier 2 augments that honestly excite me. Each adds an active element to the action skill, either sending out an additional type of projectile in the case of unmissable missiles and Hell in a Shell, or allowing you to detach the cannons entirely and create a turret in the case of Instant Fort Battle System. The capstones further push those boundaries, changing the cannons from simple machine guns to something else entirely, either shotguns that can ricochet bullets, beam weapons that deal shock and corrosive damage, or rockets that are all about AoE. There's a lot of build flexibility here without needing to really change or adapt your playstyle to accommodate those choices. The final action skill is called Apophis Lance. When active, Rafa's offhand turns into an arm cannon, allowing him to fire out a piercing shock orb. This ability has multiple charges, but if you choose to hold the charge, the projectile will deal increased damage, become larger, and move faster, while at the cost of using all of the charges. To really maximize this action skill, you want to access it as often as possible, as it's another projectile to weave into your gunplay. That obviously can be accomplished within a build, but you might not realize its full potential until the end game. Both Tier 1 Apophis Lance augments help players utilize the action skill more, either increasing the cooldown rate or giving you an additional charge. As you get a feel for the ability, those things are helpful, but the Tier 2 action skills is where you can start shaping a future build. What I will say is that even these additional augments don't drastically change the way the action skill functions, but they do set up the respective capstones directly, which do substantially change the way the ability works. Project Raiju turns the weapon into a close-range taser that deals shock damage in an AoE arc. Project Basilisk allows you to fire a corrosive blob that leaves a corrosive hazard and splits into smaller blobs whenever it detonates. And Project Gorgon turns the lance into a straight-up cannon that pierces enemies and deals incendiary damage and chains to nearby enemies. Up until this point, you might not see the full potential of the action skill, but once you have access to the capstones that change the functionality, it becomes much clearer how you can build around the ability. Rafa is well-rounded, and you need one of those Vault Hunters in a Borderlands game. All three of his action skills are easy to wrap your head around, and because his trait is straightforward, you don't have to worry about the interplay as much as you do with the other characters. That being said, I do think some folks might find him a bit boring, especially during the leveling experience before you have access to his full skill trees, but that doesn't mean he won't be effective. He's a reliable Vault Hunter that can consistently output a surprising amount of damage without factoring in any of the game-breaking builds we're used to seeing in a Borderlands game. Vex is Borderlands 4's Siren, and like in previous games, she is the pet class character that can give you access to companions that fight alongside you, albeit different than your more traditional hunter-style pets. However, what makes Vex unique is how different her three action skills are, offering you very different options depending on your playstyle and aggression levels. Phase Covenant is Vex's trait, and it attunes her action skill and melee damage to her current gun. This ends up being one of the most consequential traits in the game because it requires you to have a clear understanding of the game's damage types and their effectiveness against different enemy armor types. A great Vex player will have a number of weapons in their arsenal spanning the different damage types and swapping between them as needed to address the enemies in front of them. Everything in Vex's kit is linked together, and that's all because of the Phase Covenant trait. Deadringer is Vex's first action skill, and this one offers two completely different effects depending on what you need. When activated, you can choose to spawn either a Reaper that taunts enemies and deals melee damage, or a stationary Spectre which deals gun damage. Either can be useful, but it depends on your needs, and since you can summon multiple minions at one time, you can adapt based on your situation. This is a fantastic skill if you're playing solo because the Reaper can be used to instantly shift the enemy pressure from you to your spectral companion. On the other hand, the Spectre is pure damage, which can be invaluable as you run around the battlefield, attacking enemies and drawing their attention. Because Deadringer has two independent effects, you have to consider your augments more carefully. Options like Hellish Harvest enhance your Reaper, but have no effect on your Spectre. Similarly, something like Wither, which gives your Spectre new functionality, does nothing to change the potency of your Reaper. You can still summon either at will, but you might not be getting the full effect of your augment. Other options like Coven give you on-demand passive buffs, which are nice, but not nearly as flashy. However, once you unlock Vex's capstones, Deadringer gets really nutty. Dark Pact allows you to equip two augments, which is ridiculously strong. Not only that, but you can also empower your minions on demand. The other two capstones are about maximizing the damage of your minions, either empowering the Spectre with the Heirloom capstone or the Reaper with the Grim Reaper capstone. If you prefer a consistent companion when exploring the world, then Vex's second action skill, Phase Familiar, is most likely the choice for you. When equipped, you'll summon Trouble, a spectral minion that will fight by your side during skirmishes. When you activate the ability, Trouble will teleport, dealing damage in an AoE while also regaining full health and receiving a buff to its damage for a short period of time. What's unique about Trouble is that while you can empower the companion, it's a constant threat so long as it remains alive, and while it can be killed, that omnipresence can be very helpful, especially when confronted with multiple enemies. Because Trouble is a relatively one-dimensional companion, you end up with a series of augment options that are pretty easy to dissect. All 5 of the current augments introduce a new command skill into the mix, allowing you to, on demand, trigger something new about the Spectral Cat. For example, Violent Outburst allows you to straight up explode Trouble, dealing damage in an AoE around the companion. Other augments like Hexus Nexus give Trouble the ability to taunt enemies, while on command you can force it to charge enemies, spawning a singularity that pulls nearby enemies in. Each command skill is a little different, and what you choose is really going to depend on how you like to play. Unlike the augments, the capstones don't give you more on-demand control of Trouble, but instead greatly enhance one aspect of the companion. Unsealed is the most interesting capstone, as it allows Trouble to now mark its current target, increasing the amount of gun damage that enemy takes. There's also a kill effect that increases Trouble's ability to stay alive and deal damage. The other 2 capstones, Trouble Bubble and Double Trouble, are more about Trouble itself, increasing the familiar's survivability while also directly increasing its ability to deal damage, either through illusions or a constant damaging aura. Vex's final action skill, Incarnate, is less about companions and more about pure firepower. When used, she erupts in a phase explosion, dealing damage in an AoE around her. For the next 25 seconds, Vex moves faster and can cast Eldritch Blast from her offhand, dealing damage to enemies in an AoE around the impact point. While in this form, gun damage also reduces the Eldritch Blast cooldown, opening up the door for some absolutely bonkers build potential, as well as some direct improvements via an augment and capstone. For most of the relevant augments, you'll find that the name of the game is increasing your damage output, but how each augment goes about that is slightly different. Something like Witchy Triggerfinger is more closely tied to augmenting your gun's damage, whereas something like Geistwave is a bit more unique, increasing Vex's overall damage potential by debuffing enemies hit by the wave attack. There are a number of augments that provide Vex survivability, which makes sense given that she doesn't have a companion to protect her when this skill is active, and depending on your playstyle and level of aggression, you might find one of those augments fits better into the mix. As far as the capstones go, well, as you might expect, it's all about Eldritch Blast, making it the most potent offensive ability, changing the nature of the ability in the way that might fit your playstyle. Specifically, the Heart Piercer capstone is really interesting because it also adds some co-op utility, allowing the action skill to heal allies when hit by the blast. To play Vex effectively, we need to go back to her trait and remember that the damage type of her action skills we just discussed are directly tied to the gun that she's using. First and foremost, understanding that relationship is key because it allows you to either deal insane amounts of damage to susceptible enemies or hit like a wet noodle, which makes her skill cap incredibly high as you have to juggle weapons and skills dynamically based on the encounter. That being said, she does have a lot of flexibility with her action skills, which I think makes her accessible to all sorts of playstyles, and whether you want a more traditional hunter pet, something a bit more unique with the Spectre and Reaper combo, or you just want to go all out offense with Incarnate, I would say Vex offers a little bit of something unique for everyone. Amon is easily the odd Vault Hunter out, purely based on his melee-focused playstyle. Early game, while you're still leveling up and unlocking passives and augments, you might find that he's a bit clunky, but once you can realize a complete build, he can stand on his own or within a co-op group, so long as you can get a handle on his very unique kit. Unlike the other Vault Hunters, Amon actually has 3 different active traits, all of which are tied to the action skill currently equipped. The first is called Firewall, connected to the Scourge action skill. When used, Amon deploys a large digital wall that absorbs any enemy projectiles that pass through and buff the damage and projectile speed of any allied bullets that pass through. Absorb damage is converted into Vengeance so long as the Scourge ability is active. Enemies also take incendiary damage over time if they're anywhere near the firewall. This is the most indirect of the 3 active traits, but also the one that could have the most impact within a group setting. The second trait, Double Edge, is tied to the Crucible action skill, and this one is straightforward. When used, Amon throws out a twinned Forge Axe, dealing cryo melee damage to any enemies it passes through, while dealing incendiary melee damage if it hits enemies on the way back. Think of a boomerang. The final trait, Molten Slam, is tied to the third action skill, Onslaughter. When used, Amon slams his Forge Hammer into the ground, dealing incendiary melee damage in a medium-sized AoE around the character. Now, because each trait is tied to the action skill, there's nothing really to dissect. You'll just want to make sure you're utilizing both the trait and the action skill together, which is true for every Vault Hunter. Scourge is Amon's first action skill, and it's one of the more unique offerings in the game. When activated, Amon lifts his shield, absorbing all frontal damage as Vengeance. When the Vengeance meter is filled, Amon also receives a massive damage reduction. While active, you can also send out a Forge Wave by pressing F on keyboard or left bumper on controller. This deals cryo ordnance damage to all enemies it passes through, consuming Vengeance to increase its damage. There's two parts to this action skill: the defensive aspect that requires you to actively soak damage coming your way, building Vengeance, and the offensive part, using Forge Wave to deal piercing cryo damage. The key is to master the art of the shield, because the better you get at soaking damage, the more Vengeance you can accumulate, which in turn makes the ability even more potent. When you add augments and capstones into the mix, things get even more interesting, because these all directly change the nature of the action skill. Something like Blast Chill is more straightforward, adding an AoE component to the ability and creating a nice synergy with Firewall, the trait. There are other offensive first augments as well, and while they're each a bit different, they're absolutely aimed at maximizing the damage potential of the ability. On the flip side, an augment like Cryonic Thrum is more focused on utility, giving him a taunt and restoring health to nearby allies, on top of some modest bonus gun damage. The other augments fall somewhere on that spectrum, but in the case of something like Stormlance, the ability completely changes from cryo to storm damage, which I also think is really interesting. As far as the capstones go, each of these three options changes the nature of the Firewall trait entirely. Ring of Frostfire changes the wall into a ring, dealing incendiary damage to enemies inside and cryo damage to enemies that pass through the barrier. Glacial Rapture is completely different. When used, Amon will swing Forge Whips, dealing multiple instances of cryo damage before creating a Cryonic Fissure that deals damage and leaves an AoE on the ground for a few seconds. Finally, there's Wrathfall, which, when used, calls down a massive Forge Sword, dealing a high amount of shock damage to enemies in the area. What you choose is going to come down to what type of damage you want to deal, and that's going to be influenced by your build. Ring of Frostfire is most similar to Firewall, while the others transform the trait into something offensively focused. Amon's second action skill is called Crucible. When used, you get the choice to throw out either a Flame Axe dealing incendiary melee damage, or a Frost Axe dealing cryo melee damage. Enemies that are hit by the ability are primed and will detonate when they die or are damaged by another Forge skill, dealing damage to nearby enemies. You can hold up to 3 charges of this ability at any one time, and if you go pick up the axe, you gain a decent amount of charge back. I really like this skill because it's straightforward and fun to use. Weaving this into your gunplay becomes seamless, and as you augment the ability, it only gets better. The first 2 augments you unlock for Crucible are straightforward and perfect as you're leveling up. Axe and Stone grants you increased movement speed and gives you the chance to reduce the cooldown of your action skill and ordnance, while Endless War is all about empowering your guns and spawning additional heat-seeking Forge Axes. This actually ends up being a really interesting augment, as it turns Amon into a sort of summoner, and you can lean into that identity even more with additional passive nodes scattered throughout his tree. Where things get interesting are with the second tier of augments, 2 of which change the status damage profile of the action skill. Hour of the Hammer allows you to deal frost or shock damage, while Blade Tempest allows you to deal flame or shock damage. There are some additional quirks to each augment too, which further transforms the ability. The capstone functions a bit different, actually changing the nature of your trait, Double Edge. Snowmaul deals cryo damage and adds a ricocheting effect to the ability. Storm Surge changes the damage to shock and adds an AoE component, and Conflangerang embraces incendiary damage more so than the initial trait. Amon's final action skill is called Onslaughter, and it's the one I think has the most upside potential. When activated, Amon gains constant shield regeneration, bonus incendiary damage with guns, and increased movement speed. While active, you can also use your melee attack to rocket punch, dashing to the targeted enemy, dealing incendiary melee damage in a cone and causing stagger. That's a lot of things happening at one time, and when you weave in your Molten Slam trait, it gets really intense, in a good way. The action skill by nature encourages aggressive play, but also gives you that added defensiveness in the form of the constant shield regeneration to lean into that playstyle. As you might expect with an ability of this nature, all of Amon's 5 augments that enhance this action skill just make it more offensively potent. Something like Pyroclast further encourages being up in the enemy's face by adding an AoE effect around Amon and increasing his survivability, while all 3 of the tier 2 augments allow you to lean into different damage types, which is consistent with the other skill trees. This is easily Amon's most aggressive action skill, which I think is going to speak to a lot of players that are initially interested in playing him. As we've seen with the other skill trees, the capstones change the nature of the trait. Core Cleave changes the damage type to Cryo and now is a wave attack. Molten Rail amplifies what you already had with Molten Slam, adding even more size and damage to the trait, and Stormcutter changes things up to deal shock damage in a wave while also making your skills recharge faster. Amon, more than any other character, has 3 distinct action skills, and each substantially changes the way he plays. This can be a bit awkward as you're leveling up, and things like Scourge might not feel great, but as you progress into harder content with more passive skill nodes unlocked, everything starts to come into focus. Amon, by design, is a melee-oriented character, and while you absolutely can still deal insane amounts of damage with guns, you'd be a fool not to embrace his character identity, whether that's with the whip, the axe, or gauntlet. Calculated aggression is the name of the game, and with the right build, you can easily hold your own solo or in co-op. Harlowe is all about technology and understanding how things work, and as such, she has a wide range of gadgets that she brings to a fight that ultimately determine her playstyle. She is one of, if not the most flexible Vault Hunter of the lot, because her active abilities hit across all points on the spectrum, which is why she's great as a member of a co-op group. Don't let that fool you though, she has some wild build potential that makes her an absolute killer. Her trait, Entanglement, is essential to understanding how to build out her character because it has such a broad impact during a battle. Entanglement affects enemies whenever they're hit by any of Harlowe's active abilities. While entangled, those enemies share a portion of the gun damage and skill damage with other entangled enemies. Think of this as a chaining effect that also acts as a damage amp. Your goal should be to hit as many enemies as you can with your action skills. The more you hit, the more damage you do across the entire group of entangled foes. Harlowe has 3 action skills, and like I mentioned before, they all fall along a spectrum of skills that change how Harlowe functions individually and as a member of a group. Chroma Accelerator is easily the most flashy action skill. When used, she fires out an unstable energy pocket which travels in a straight line, passing through enemies, dealing cryo damage to any hit. When activated again, or if it comes into contact with a floor or wall, the unstable energy pocket explodes, dealing radiation damage. Of Harlowe's 3 abilities, this one has the most versatility because of its range. You have a ton of control over where you shoot the orb, when to explode it, and ultimately how many enemies you hit with the explosion, which is incredibly powerful when paired with the right augment and capstone. As you level up, you'll see that almost every one of the augments is directly increasing the pure output of this ability. That's because Chroma Accelerator is the most offensive forward action skill that Harlowe has. Something like Neutron Capture has more interplay with Harlowe's actual weapons, increasing your gun damage based on how many enemies you hit with the skill, but other augments such as Containment Breach are about maximizing the ability's damage. As far as capstones go, we see that trend continue with 3 very unique options that drastically change the nature of the skill. The most interesting is the Shattering Light, which allows you to send out multiple instances of the unstable energy pocket during the duration of the skill, giving you even more opportunities to entangle enemies. The second action skill is called Flux Generator, and it's much more co-op focused. When used, Harlowe throws out the Flux Generator in front of her. From wherever it lands, it generates a large spherical energy field, dealing cryo damage, entangling enemies, and providing an overshield to any allies within the AoE. When placed correctly, this can absolutely save you or your team, but it requires precision, and that's not always possible when you're running and gunning. Luckily, you can redeploy the flux generator, allowing you to correct for bad positioning, or if you want to move it to target a different group of enemies. The utility is great, but the issue is how often you're dealing with enemies that are spread apart. It can be a real pain to try and get this in a spot that affects multiple enemies, and oftentimes that means running headlong into a group of enemies so you're more accurately placing the generator. That being said, there are some truly insane augments and capstones that make this action skill worth considering. It really comes down to how you plan to play Harlowe, either solo or in a consistent co-op group, because the augments for this ability run the gamut. Augments like Coronal Mass Ejection, Unified Theory, and Nuclear Winter all tie into a multiplayer experience, increasing the potency of their effects depending on how many allies are within the radius of the generator. Other augments aim to increase the skill's standalone potency, and while still not the flashiest of action skills, these can drastically improve how effective the flux generator is during a battle. The capstones are where this skill really gets interesting, as all three are vastly different from one another. Depending on your build direction, you could choose to lean into potential transference, which grants a free second wind, really emphasizing Harlowe's co-op utility. On the other hand, something like Violet Horizon is more in line with some of the other augments that look to singularly increase the damage of the action skill. Even still, then there's Group Study, which completely changes the action skill, instead providing flat stat boost to you and your allies, replacing the original generator effect. Harlowe's final action skill is called 0 Point, and this one is all about crowd control. When used, she places an enemy in stasis, suspending them for 10 seconds. When triggered again, that enemy is slammed into the ground in the direction Harlowe's facing, and you can do that a couple times within the 10-second window. 0 Point is far and away the weakest of Harlowe's abilities to start, mainly because you can only suspend a single target. Also, enemies that are immune to stasis, such as bosses, just take a boring flat amount of damage. Now, this action skill gets way better with augments and capstones, but it has some of the worst interplay with your trait early on, and that's really Harlowe's bread and butter. That being said, you can take this action skill a number of different directions. It all really depends on if you want crowd control utility or not. 0 Point starts to get flexibility because of its augments. Some of them directly aim to increase the damage potential of the target suspended in stasis. Now, this can be really helpful when trying to take down elite enemies, and often these augments either extend the duration of the effect or reduce the action skill's cooldown. Other augments like Peer Review are more aimed at providing co-op utility, which isn't bad, but niche. Other augments still expand how many targets you can suspend in stasis, and I think this is where the skill starts to take shape, because it has the most synergy with Harlowe's trait, Entanglement, which, as we've discussed, is central to her playstyle. The capstones for 0 Point are relatively straightforward. 2 of them directly increase the damage of the skill by weaving in different variables without changing the nature of how the skill works. The third capstone, Falling Bodies, allows you to stasis multiple targets, which again has the most interplay with Harlowe's trait, making this a fantastic choice for most encounters outside of boss fights. Harlowe is, by my measure, one of the most fun Vault Hunters to play because she has the most flexibility within her kit. She's not just about offense or defense, but a combination of both, and it's clear the team was thinking about co-op when they designed her. What I found to be the most fun was playing super aggressive with her and really mastering Chroma Accelerator, which I believe has the most damage potential of her action skills, especially early on. Her other abilities are still good, but they're more tailored for co-op, especially Flux Generator. Harlowe is also unique in that her skill tree emphasizes 2 damage types, Cryo and Radiation, which I'd say are the more niche damage types in the game. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you do need to understand how each damage type works, which is something we talk about in our Ultimate Beginner's Guide, so if you haven't checked out that video yet, I definitely would. Harlowe isn't your typical run-and-gun Vault Hunter, but she's also not built for the backline. She's most potent in the fray, utilizing her tech at every opportunity and relying on the benefits they bring to the table to constantly chip away at enemies until eventually they all die. So there you have it, everything you need to know about the 4 Vault Hunters in Borderlands 4. Guys, we are having a blast covering this game, so if you want more Borderlands in your feed, do me a solid, hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. Don't forget, you can also join our Discord community of over 15,000 members. Be the first to learn about new legacy gaming content, talk about new games, and share tips and tricks with other Vault Hunters just like you. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.